Welcome to the Socialist Legacy. I'm Reed Kane. We are streaming actually an hour later than usual today on the Sublation Media Twitch channel. We stream every Tuesday evening, usually at 5 o'clock Eastern Time. It's going to be a little bit of a shorter stream today, unfortunately. But just so with that in mind, I figure we would just dive right in. So today I wanted to discuss an article that a viewer recommended to me, and interested in soliciting my thoughts on it. The article was published in Cosmonaut magazine, and it's titled "State, Democracy, and Transition: Is There a Democratic Road to Socialism?" The author's name is Maxi Nieto. Hopefully, I'm pronouncing that correctly. Um, so I don't want to go through the whole argument. I kind of just wanted to highlight a few points um, that I thought were worth discussing that would be instructive given our time constraints. And I might come back to the article next week and kind of round out the discussion a little bit. The article, the premise of the article is essentially a critique of the kind of gradualist reformism of kind of various popular strains of socialism today, specifically DSA, I think is the main target. So, um, just to set up the article, so this is one of the introductory paragraphs. Since the financial crisis of 2008, a new democratic socialism, DSA, Podemos, Syriza, Jacobin, has been gaining influence, advancing the idea of a gradual socialist transition away from the existing state structures. The purpose of this article is to submit to criticism, starting from Marx's Capital, the theoretical and political assumptions of this proposed gradualist strategy. This strategy tends to be based on a faulty perception of the fundamental structures that make up the capitalist mode of production as an organic system. In contrast to this view, and also starting from Marx, the revolutionary communist perspective is presented and its main political foundations are established, leading to a critical consideration of certain fundamental aspects of the historical and political experience as viewed from that tradition. So I'm going to breeze past the setup of the article in which the author um, describes the kind of evasion of Marx's conception by these gradualist socialists, and then goes into some depth about how they understand Marx's conception. Um, and in lieu of that, I kind of want to make a beeline for some of the political, critical political points that come at the end of the article. So um, first and foremost, the author wants to make clear. I say first and foremost, not again, not in the sense of the flow of the article's argument, but in the sense of what I'm interested in discussing. The author wants to make clear that, as far as they're concerned, from a Marxist perspective, communism cannot be developed from within the capitalist mode of production. Now, I think this is, I think there's a point here that maybe the author is trying to make, but is confused about. Or perhaps there's just a disagreement, some kind of substantive disagreement. Um, I think it's certainly the case that socialism or communism cannot develop under capitalism in the sense of under the rule of the capitalist class, or more generally, um, cannot develop short of the conquest of political power by the proletariat. That the dictatorship of the proletariat is an essential condition for the development of socialism. And the author seems to agree with this point. Um, but where the difference of opinion lies is that the author seems to think that from the moment that the proletariat conquers political power, there is a kind of interruption in the economic structure of capitalist production, such that by the point that the proletarian state reestablishes a functional economic um, basis for society, it will no longer be of a capitalist character. It will no longer be the capitalist mode of production. And there's a sort of political side to this point too. So it's not simply that there's a kind of conception of an economic break that occurs by virtue of this conquest of power. Um, the author says, to believe that socialism can be achieved by way of the bourgeois state is to suppose that it can be achieved through imperialism, placing the Pentagon, the US State Department, or the institutions of Atlanticism, NATO, the EU, the IMF, at the service of the workers' cause. This absurd conception demonstrates that reformism approaches reason as if imperialism did not exist, as if the question of power in the capitalist mode of production were not already operating on a global scale. So, by contrast, I would say I think it's pretty clear that for Marx, the conquest of political power would mean the working class taking over capitalist production and overseeing the transition to socialism. It would not mean an instantaneous end to the capitalist mode of production. In terms of the political um, negotiation of this transition, there was never a notion among Marxists, among Marx and Engels or any of their followers, that with the conquest of political power, the proletariat would kind of instantaneously expropriate all private property in the means of production, or even capitalist property conceived as, you know, not necessarily means of producing by a self-employed small proprietor, but means of employing wage labor, um, you know, as a kind of in lieu of that sort of petty bourgeois small proprietorship. There was always rather a notion that the priority, that a kind of central priority following the conquest of political power would be the expropriation of the commanding heights of industry. So, above all, most centrally, that would mean the financial system, as well as kind of key infrastructural sectors of the economy, transportation, communication, and certain other industries. What exactly that would be, what exactly would need to be expropriated, and how that would go, how that would proceed, are the kinds of questions that would really only meaningfully be posed in the context of a revolutionary situation. They wouldn't be the kinds of questions that can be substantially addressed ahead of time. Um, so there is furthermore this notion developed a little later in the article that the seizure of power for about the seizure of political power for Marx and Engels, what the seizure or the conquest of political power would mean for Marx and Engels. So the author says, contrary to what is believed, or pardon me, contrary to what is usually believed, the revolutionary perspective of Marx, Engels, or Lenin does not generally prescribe a concrete formula for the conquest of power, but is limited to establishing the need for a violent break with the current legality. Now, I find that formulation very hard to swallow. I don't think that that's that's either, I think, poorly phrased or misunderstanding on the author's part. Um, Marx, Engels, and Lenin certainly understood the necessity and likely the inevitability of a of the need for a violent struggle, in the sense that violence would be that the effort to conquer political power by legitimate means, the means recognized by the masses of people in society, um, would be met with violent suppression by the representatives, the defenders of the prevailing order, the capitalist social order. And hence that the working class movement would have to meet violent suppression with force. But this would essentially be you might say, a defensive or a kind of self defensive measure. It wouldn't be a matter of um, kind of storming the Winter Palace in the sense of a kind of romanticized conception of the October Revolution, um, or really the kind of conception that harkens back to the late 18th and early 19th century conception of revolution as a kind of a band of conspirators that organize a coup d'état in which they, you know, incite rebellion in the streets and use the ensuing confusion to seize the kind of levers of power in the state and um, arrest the the previous rulers and take them into custody in the name of the people. Um, this is While I don't think Marx and Engels, or Lenin for that matter, ever wrote off this sort of um, insurrectionary conception of revolution, I also don't think that they understood that to be the even in Russia. I mean, if anything, it had more applicability to the Russian situation in the early 20th century than it did probably anywhere else. Um, Maybe somewhat more so in Germany as well as compared to, say, France or Britain or the United States. Um, but nonetheless, the conception wasn't one of um, this kind of conspiratorial minority inciting, a kind of inciting some kind of mass unrest and using that as the opportunity to seize political power by violent means. Rather, certainly in situations where there is at least an ostensibly legitimate democratic process. And of course, one of the main arguments of this article is that capitalism and democracy are not compatible, and you can't have an actual democratic process in the context of capitalism. And I think that's a point I'd like to maybe come back to next week. Um, but at least where there is the trappings of legitimate democratic uh, a legitimate democratic struggle for political power, the point would be to make the effort and to win over the majority to that effort, to the point that um, it generates a political crisis for the existing regime and forces their hand, in the sense that they have to do something to prevent the um, this sort of upsurge of support for a legitimate democratic transfer of power to a revolutionary party, from leading to some sort of, uh, well, for one thing, preventing it from actually undermining their position, but also um, in lieu of their conceding political power, um, you would need to prevent mass unrest from arising as a result. So, yeah, I don't think and I think that some of the further considerations uh, rooted in this about the parliamentary route to power that the author makes are very confused in failing to distinguish what is a really essential point for Marx and Engels and for Lenin going into the Third International, the Comintern, which the author of the article cites, cites the decisions, the theses approved by the Comintern as kind of authoritative in some sense, or at least as instructive, but failing to note this essential distinction between what Marx and Engels called parliamentary cretinism and revolutionary parliamentarism, or the revolutionary use of reactionary parliaments, as as Lenin might put it. If you've read Lenin's Left Wing Communism, you'll know how essential Lenin considered the use of reactionary parliaments as well as reactionary trade unions and so on. Um, but the point would be that there is a means of making use of these kinds of institutions, of engaging with them in a revolutionary manner. And it's not a question of whether or not one is pursuing a parliamentary road, a parliamentary route, a parliamentary strategy. This sort of confuses the issue, and this is, I think, one of the central problems with this article on a number of points. And I'll touch on just maybe one more, and then turn over this stream to a discussion, and maybe discuss some further points next week. The other major point here would be the struggle for reforms. So the author um, kind of tries to contrast this gradualist conception of reforms, seeing reforms in that benefit the working class as conquests building towards a final victory of socialism. So kind of incrementally stacking up to the point where it would either make a socialist transition necessary or otherwise would be kind of incrementally implementing that transition. So the author says, on the other hand, the Marxist tradition considers that social and democratic reforms have a contradictory effect. Undoubtedly, they do represent improvements and conquests, always transitory and partial, never completely solving the underlying problems. But at the same time, they constitute an instrument of dominance and legitimacy that creates illusions in bourgeois institutions. In any case, reforms are never cumulative, and the greatest advances have always come as a result of revolutionary struggles, as occurred with the drastic reduction of the working day in Europe following the Bolshevik triumph of 1917, or with the implementation of the welfare state in Europe after the defeat of Nazism by the USSR, and thanks to the strength of the communist parties. So this is just, I think, a real hash of this question, a question that we addressed last week in the stream. And by the way, I have not yet managed to get that video posted on YouTube. I plan to do so tomorrow or at the latest on Thursday. I apologize for being behind schedule on that. I feel like I struggled a bit to articulate because there was a lot to discuss. Um, what exactly is at stake in that issue in a concise manner last week, and I don't think I'm going to be able to do it this week. But I will just flag this and say that the author here is really ignoring the question of the politics of the reform struggle, how this struggle is undertaken. Namely, for Marx and Engels, essentially this struggle needed to be undertaken from the standpoint of opposition, and there is a conflation in the article, or at least a lack of care to the distinction between the state government in the sense of the executive and and the and elected positions in the legislature. So I think these are all points that I want to go over in more detail next week, but I'm just flagging some of them now. Um, so one more point. Well, let me quote Lenin briefly, um, because I did bring up this idea about the transitional state, the dictatorship of the proletariat as a transitional state. And while, I think there is good reason to be skeptical of the notion that, um, various institutions of international capitalism and of US foreign policy would serve as instruments for a socialist, government, a dictatorship of the proletariat in the United States, and a means of prosecuting international socialist revolution. I think makes perfectly good sense to be skeptical of the notion that, for example, the Pentagon would become an instrument of proletarian dictatorship. The point is nonetheless that it would have to that the proletarian dictatorship would have to do something with what it inherits from capitalism, including all of these institutions. Now, what exactly it does with them, how it goes about doing that, is a complicated question. But in terms of the violent attack on the existing legality and the notion that there has to be some sort of stark and dramatic break with the bourgeois order, um, I wanted to quote from The State and Revolution by Lenin. So, in its first phase or first stage, communism cannot as yet be fully mature economically and entirely free from traditions or vestiges of capitalism. Hence, the interesting phenomenon that communism in its first phase retains, quote, the narrow horizon of bourgeois law or right, quoting Marx's Critique of the Gotha program. Of course, bourgeois law in regard to the distribution of consumer goods inevitably presupposes the existence of the bourgeois state, for law is nothing without an apparatus capable of enforcing the observance of the rules of law. It follows that under communism, there remains for a time not only bourgeois law, but even the bourgeois state without the bourgeoisie. This may sound like a paradox or simply a dialectical conundrum, of which Marxism is often accused by people who have not taken the slightest trouble to study its extraordinarily profound content. But in fact, remnants of the old surviving in the new confront us in life at every step, both in nature and in society. And Marx did not arbitrarily insert a scrap of bourgeois law into communism, but indicated what is economically and politically inevitable in a society emerging out of the womb of capitalism. Okay, um, so yeah, just to put a point on it, and then I'll turn it over to discussion. Um, this idea that there is a stark, dramatic break between communism and capitalism, um, is, I think, of a piece with this confusion over the nature of the conquest of political power, the nature of the struggle for reforms, and other questions. I'm certainly sympathetic to the critique of this kind of reformist conception of socialism that you find in DSA circles, but I think this critique is, if anything, it creates a whole nother set of problems rather than really doing much to clarify what's wrong with that perspective. Um, and I'll go into more detail about that next week and maybe in this discussion. But um, okay, I'll leave it there and see if there's any questions or thoughts, Clint, or if anyone in the chat has anything they'd like to add.
Awesome. So just to sort of briefly review 4 points you made, and I'm sure that these will all be previewing the discussion next week. But the first one being that the organized working class is literally it has to literally is the last thing that's capable of, so to speak, saving society. That it is actually the proletariat organized that would want to conserve order, as opposed to just like the fetishization of violence or something like that. It's as Kautsky put it, it's neither legality nor non-legality. And then secondly, the role of democracy, and whether, if the problem with capitalism is that it's undemocratic. I recall it's a very common refrain on the, so to speak, more radical left, to take this sort of Beardian view where the Constitutional Convention in the U.S. is a conservative, or it's like a Thermidorian reaction against the more populist democratic 1776. And so where the problem with capitalism becomes a problem of democracy per se, and that it's actually a matter of winning the battle of democracy, and not the battle for democracy. That democracy is a sort of way that capitalism actually reconstitutes itself. And then the third one being the difference between sort of parliamentary cretinism, thinking that parliament is an end in itself, as opposed to the politics of using parliament. And then what would it mean to how the bourgeois state, itself a function of crisis, is can't just be destroyed in one blow. That insofar as the proletariat is now taking responsibility for the crisis, it's going to have to pose the politics of the transitional state, meaning what it means to take over the bourgeois state.
Well, I think, I mean, so in terms of smashing the state, right? This idea of smashing the state, and this is something I would have gone into some more detail if I had more time, but maybe to abbreviate the point, the conception is that there is this excrescence. The state has become this kind of excrescence over and above society, a kind of an institution unto itself with its kind of own internal logic, and that's represented by the bureaucracy, the state bureaucracy, as not as a class, in the same sense that we would think of the proletariat and the capitalist class as distinct classes, but nonetheless as a kind of element in society that has a distinct function and role and set of interests that are kind of derivative of the class struggle, and really of the failure of the class struggle to resolve itself at the moment that kind of initially became possible. So this is this kind of idea of Bonapartism as a situation in which the state is compensating for the fact that the bourgeoisie is no longer able to rule, but the proletariat's not yet able to rule. So the state takes on a kind of set of functions in which it must sort of suppress the class struggle, not simply in the sense of suppressing the working class, although that is certainly part of it. But more than that, it has to kind of balance the various contending interests in society and sort of prevent the various kind of disruptions and incoherences and crises that emerge within society from leading to kind of any kind of fundamental destabilization of social order. And in that sense, a kind of revolutionary class struggle of the proletariat from the perspective of the state or the ruling class more generally, is really a symptom of kind of social breakdown and social disorder, right? It's not really understood as like a legitimate expression of, popular sovereignty, or a desire for the extension of popular sovereignty beyond its present form or something like that. Um, and there's a whole series of issues involved with this question of Bonapartism and the way it's sort of fudged in this article. But I think we can leave those till next time. For the purposes of what you were just saying, Clint, I think it's important to recognize that when we're talking about smashing the state, when that idea of smashing the state, it's essentially at stake is smashing the bureaucracy, right? So if you think about like when, and that means the executive. So again, I was saying that there's this kind of fudging going on where it's not clear what is being discussed when we're talking about the state, right? There's a sense in which the state is seen as by the gradualists or reformists as a battlefield that can be contended, in which socialists can contend, right? Can seek to gain some leverage, gain a foothold. But what are we talking about there? Are we talking about seats in the legislature? Are we talking about being part of the executive branch, having, if we were in a parliamentary system, having, ministers, taken, ministers, socialist parliamentarian, parliamentary representatives, taken into a kind of coalition government as ministers. In the United States, that sort of thing is less common because you don't really have a coalition system for establishing the government. But nonetheless, there is occasionally gestures towards bipartisan, um, you know, bipartisan um, members of the cabinet and things like that. Um, but more than that, it's not just about the kind of political appointees. So when you elect a new president, like if a Republican becomes president in 2024, they're going to, dismiss the Democratic appointees to the cabinet positions, or at least most of them, and replace them. So there's that kind of like top level of the executive bureaucracy that's staffed by political appointees. But there's also a very deep kind of stratum of, high level bureaucrats that may or may not be loyal in some sense to one of the two parties, but more importantly, are loyal to the state itself, right? In the sense of the existing political order and really the social order that it presides over. So when you're talking about like the deep state, this kind of rhetoric of the deep state, that's really the point, is that there is this kind of government bureaucracy, civil service bureaucracy that is entrenched and ultimately, kind of control the operations of power. And the political appointees, while they have, some measure of authority, ultimately have to work with what's there, right? They have to work with the system that's there. Um, of course, the most important aspects of the bureaucracy, from the kind of revolutionary perspective, are the police and military forces that are presided over by this bureaucratic, you know, system. Um, and probably most menacingly, there are the countless, intelligence agencies, the FBI, and of course, police forces at various levels, federal, state, local, as well as the military. So, there is this whole question of essentially kicking out a huge mass of bureaucrats and replacing them with people, with workers that are loyal to the revolutionary socialist movement, or at least to the labor movement. And that can be counted on to, you know, to oversee a transformation of the instruments of political power, in a manner consonant with the aims of the of the socialist revolution. So in that situation, you'd have to, so this idea, like, would the US State Department be, undertaking international socialist revolution? Well, potentially, right? But it would be a completely transformed, you know, institution, because you would have stripped out, all of the significant, maybe not the entire staff, because there's obviously like lower level staff that aren't necessarily going to be um, as much of a concern, although there are always going to be concerns in these sorts of situations. But what you really need to do is replace um, the high levels of management of these institutions, of these departments. And from that perspective, there are kind of really complicated, substantial questions about what do we do with what we've now inherited, right? So, for example, the Bolsheviks published all of the secret correspondences and treaties of the czarist regime, which also, implicated all of the other governments of Europe, and that was kind of seen as a major, a kind of major blow to the international capitalist order in the sense of helping to instigate a further revolutionary situation in the rest of the continent. Um, so yeah, I mean, no, we're not talking about like NATO becoming a socialist institution just because Eugene Debs Jr. is elected president or something like that, right? It's not like that sort of superficial conception. And especially now, this gets to that question of violence and force. Um, let's say uh, a socialist presidential administration is elected in the United States, and they do undertake this kind of dramatic overturning of the existing bureaucracy, which would mean not only dismissing and the management, the administrations of these departments, um, and dramatic kind of restructuring and repurposing of what's there. In many cases, it would mean just kind of dissolving a lot of the executive branch. Probably it would be presumably a very dramatic reduction in the size of the government, but maybe not instantaneously because there's serious liabilities. You can't just, for example, I mean, I would be seriously concerned about the idea that you could just close down the CIA and kick them all out of Langley. Because if anybody has the means and the know-how to undermine a socialist regime taking power in the United States, those would be the people that would know how to do it, that would have the means to do it. And you could tell them to leave, the building, the government building they have at Langley, but you'd be a fool to think that they don't have resources at their disposal that are opaque to the civilian regime, the civilian political, you know, leadership of the state. So it would be a complicated proposition, but you would have to do that. You would have to do something, right? And not only that, um, a big part of what you would be doing would be creating a counter-revolutionary force that very well could manifest through violent, a violent attempted violent suppression, insurrection, civil war. This is if you're able to even have your administration, your president sworn in and your administration staffed and so on, which even that's a big question if you would get that far, right? It would depend on a lot of complicated factors. So it's a big complicated question, but you can't just hand wave it away by saying, well, it would be a dramatic, you know, there's this kind of idea that there's an almost anarchist-ish notion that there would just be kind of instantaneous transformation. But what would happen to this massive bureaucratic military police machine that's sitting there already, essentially policing the world, domestically and internationally? And connected to that, and I know I'm focusing more on the political side of it, but connected to that, this idea that capitalism would simply instantaneously come to an end and be replaced with something else by virtue of a change in the political leadership it's just kind of, I think it's a dramatic oversimplification, at to put it lightly, of what is actually at stake in this discussion of capitalism, what Marx understands by capitalism, the capitalist mode of production. But that gets into some issues that I don't necessarily want to bring up today for reasons of time. So next.
Yeah, to paraphrase Lukács, the proletariat itself is the final boss.
Right.
So Stajan73 asks, a possible route to the DOP through democracy, in effect using the alleged possibilities, but this is distinct from the pursuit of from its pursuit as an end in itself for what is essentially a capitalist democracy. So what is this distinction between gradualism and the pursuit of the DOP as it becomes manifest in the way that we're thinking about democracy?
So I think the critique of gradualism in this article, which I didn't go into a great deal of detail on, although honestly, I don't think it's a particularly substantial critique. But I think the critique of gradualism or reformism in this article um, is not terribly interesting or persuasive. Not because um, there isn't a lot to critique there, but because I think what the author ends up doing in the way they set up their conception of Marxism is sort of undermine their own argument against gradualism by making Marxism into a sort of caricature of itself. Fundamentally, basically what the author does is dramatically oversimplify Marx's perspective on a number of counts: political, theoretical, um, economic counts. And I touched on a few of those points here. Um, but there is, it really doesn't do any service to Marxism to oversimplify these questions. Um, you know, I'm not saying that you need to kind of come at a sort of Jacobin perspective by saying they they are not as complex as Marx is in their conception or something like that. I don't think that's the point. And I think the author of this article sort of verges on that. Despite oversimplifying Marx, they also are kind of like, these people are not grasping the depth of Marx's conception. So it's sort of like it fails on sort of both counts. I would be much more interested in a more straightforward political critique of this gradualist perspective that doesn't need to get into the weeds of Marx's sort of theoretical theoretical framework for his politics. Not because that's not interesting or important, but it's just, if you're going to oversimplify it, then I don't think it's really worth bringing up at all anyway. For among other reasons, because you don't need all of that to make these kind of political points. Um, some of which I was making last week. And for that matter, what I think is most frustrating, one of the most frustrating things in this article is the discussion of reforms, which really, it's just so dramatically botched. There is a point to saying, well, Marxists understand reforms as, on the one hand, it's a victory, but on the other hand, it's kind of essentially inadequate and unreliable, and for that matter, a liability, potential liability, at least in misleading the workers into seeing the state as having their interests in mind or something like that. But this leaves it at such a level of abstraction that it's not really even clear what we're talking about when we're talking about reforms. So the question of what is the role of the working class movement in the struggle for reforms, and hence what is the political character of the struggle for reforms, is just, it's totally ignored, with the exception of this idea that the Bolshevik Revolution was able to get us a welfare state in Europe, right? So a welfare state. I mean, so of all reforms, so here's one piece of political wisdom from Marx and Engels on the reform struggle. And I brought this up before, but it's such an important point. I will never stop hammering at it. Namely, that for Marx and Engels, no good can come from so-called state aid, for one thing. State aid is a no-go for Marx and Engels. In a sense, you could see what Kautsky called in a critical mode early in his career, state socialism. This idea that you can, or what Marx derided as the Royal Prussian imperial socialism, or Bismarckian socialism. This idea that Lassalle essentially had, that you can get socialism from above by virtue of policies, reforms undertaken by the existing state, kind of compelled, that the working class movement compels the state to institute, for political reasons, putting pressure in the right way on the state, and on the kind of split between the state bureaucracy and the bourgeois elements, in this case, in the context of the Prussian Empire. Um, so there is this kind of, um, this conception of socialism in terms of state aid. Marx and Engels are anathema, to that idea. If anything, you could kind of boil it down to a slogan, and Marx and Engels themselves put it in these terms a number of times, that, um, as opposed to state aid, they see, what they're concerned with is self-help, right? Self-help. So the workers need to help themselves, rely on themselves, walk by themselves, stand independently, rely on their own efforts, their own organization, rather than seeking state aid. Okay. So I wanted to just read a couple things to this, on this point. Um, so this is from the Critique of the Gotha program, and I I assume a lot of the people watching this will be somewhat familiar with the Gotha program. It was the document by which the Marxist Party, the Eisenach Party of Liebknecht and Liebknecht and Babel, um, the party that was kind of guided by Marx and Engels, unified with what was left of Lassalle's party. It was sort of falling apart by that point. And Marx and Engels are very critical of Liebknecht and Babel and the leadership of the Eisenach Party, because the Gotha program, the document that sealed this unification, amounted to a kind of backward step from the program of the Eisenach Party in making a number of concessions to what they considered to be the Lassalleans' confused ideas, confused and retrograde ideas. One of the central ideas being, Lassalle had this idea that, um, that Bismarck's regime should be persuaded to essentially grant loans to the workers to form cooperatives, worker cooperatives, cooperative factories, and that these cooperative factories would replace capitalist, production. That because Bismarck has this sort of antagonistic relationship to the capitalists. He's overseeing capitalist industrialization and development, but he also is trying to keep a firm hold on political power and prevent any kind of, um, efforts on the part of the rising capitalist class from destabilizing the Kaiserreich. So he's trying to kind of instrumentalize capitalist development for the sake of preserving the political power of the existing regime. Um, Now Lassalle essentially, has this perspective that the workers should try to win the government over to their cause in their struggle against the capitalists, and that the workers and the state would form a better alliance than the capitalists and the state. That Bismarck could be persuaded to see the workers as a better ally than the capitalists, a more reliable ally, and that together they could, in a sense, suppress capitalist development altogether. And these state-funded worker cooperatives would be instrumental in that process. So that's the context of this state aid that's in the Gotha program. So Marx writes, um, in place of the existing class struggle appears, oh, pardon me, let me start here. Instead of arising from the revolutionary process of transformation of society, the socialist organization of the total labor arises from the state aid that the state gives to the producers' cooperative societies, and which the state, not the workers, calls into being. It is worthy of Lassalle's imagination that with state loans, one can build a new society just as well as a new railway. From the remnants of a sense of shame, state aid has been put under the democratic control of the toiling people in the way it's formulated in the demands of the Gotha program. Um, in the first place, the majority of the toiling people in Germany consist of peasants, not proletarians. Second, democratic means rule of the people. But what does control by the rule of the people of the toiling people mean? So one of Marx's sort of, snide criticisms. Um, and particularly in the case of a toiling people, this is the important point. In the case of a toiling people which, through these demands that it puts to the state, expresses its full consciousness that it neither rules nor is ripe for ruling. Essentially what they're demanding is that the state do what they're acknowledging they're unable to do themselves. It would be superfluous to deal here with the criticism of the recipe prescribed by Boucher in the reign of Louis Philippe in opposition to the French socialists and accepted by the reactionary workers of the atelier, this idea of the state providing employment to unemployed workers through national workshops. It was crucial in the French Revolution of 1848. Marx is essentially saying Lassalle is taking up here a demand that was already a reactionary demand posed against the socialists back in the 1830s, right? And he's taking it up as if it's this kind of like advanced demand. It's quite literally a regression back behind even the earliest kind of um, you know developments of the socialist uh, struggle. The chief offense does not lie in having inscribed this specific nostrum in the program, but in taking in general a retrograde step from the standpoint of a class movement to that of a sectarian movement. That the workers desire to establish the conditions for cooperative production on a social scale, and first of all on a national scale in their own country, only means that they are working to revolutionize the present conditions of production. So, Marx's point here is this demand may appeal to the workers. And it's not that the workers would be wrong for seeing an appeal in this demand. As I said in a few other sessions, Engels described the demand for the 10-hour day as a reactionary demand. But his point in saying that was not to condemn the workers who wanted it, right? It's a political point about the way in which the struggle of the workers should be prosecuted and how the kind of setbacks they've faced should be learned from. Um, so the point here is that we need to see what appeals to the workers in this demand and how the way it's formulated can pose an obstacle to the struggle that might ultimately realize what they're seeking. So he goes on, and it has nothing in common with the foundation of cooperative societies with state aid, namely that the workers desire to revolutionize the present conditions of production. This has nothing in common with the foundation of cooperative societies with state aid. But as far as the present cooperative societies are concerned, they are of value only insofar as they are the independent creations of the workers and not proteges of either the government or the bourgeois. Um, Engels says in a letter to Babel on this point, um, that it would be better to formulate the demand in the following way. The German Workers' Party strives to abolish wage labor and hence class distinctions by introducing cooperative production into industry and agriculture and on a national scale. It is in favor of any measure calculated to attain that end. And he says no Lassallean could possibly object. So the workers that do want what this demand is formulating, you can put the demand in such a way that you will still be appealing to them without confusing the issue by formulating in terms of seeking aid from the existing state, right? So the point would be the workers will institute this policy when we take power. And we are in favor of anything that aids in that direction. But then that raises the question of, well, what would it take to do that, to have the power to do that? Um, I know I'm going on a bit, but I did want to raise one more point here, which I think is crucial. So Engels writes in another letter to Babel, and I've quoted this before, but again, I'm going to keep beating this drum. Questions which enable social democratic deputies in the Reichstag to abandon a purely negative attitude are very narrowly circumscribed. All are questions which immediately involve the relation of workers to capitalists, factory legislation, the normal working day, employers' liability, payment in goods, etc. Perhaps also improvements in the purely bourgeois sense, such as constitute a positive step forward, standardization of coins and weights, freedom of movement, extension of personal freedom, etc. He says you're unlikely to be troubled with these for the time being. So, he's not holding his breath, but nonetheless, these are the sorts of reform demands that that workers' representatives in the Reichstag could support. They're demands that, on the one hand, are strengthening the position of the workers by weakening the position of the capitalists. The state is essentially constraining the capitalists and thereby strengthening the position of the workers in their struggle, in the term struggle over the terms of employment, or vice versa. The state is, in a sense, accepting restrictions on its own ability. In the case of the freedom, extension of personal freedom, the state is accepting limitations on its own ability to curtail what people are free to do in society. In either case, it's a matter of strengthening the position of the workers vis-a-vis, on the one hand, the capitalists, and on the other hand, the state. He goes on, in the case of all other economic questions, such as protective tariffs, nationalization of the railways, assurance companies, etc., social democratic deputies must always uphold the vital principle of consenting to nothing that increases the power of the government vis-a-vis the people. And this is made all the easier in that feelings within the party itself will, of course, invariably be divided in such cases. And hence, abstention, a negative attitude, is automatically called for. So this is what Marx and Engels elsewhere referred to as the first and fundamental rule of our party tactics, the most imperative and all important rule: not a farthing for this government. So no support for anything that strengthens the government, that increases the government's ability, increases the government's power over and against people in society, with the exception of measures in which the government is constraining the capitalists in a way that benefits the workers in their struggle. So it's kind of a strategic conception there. And this is also put by Liebknecht as follows. Liebknecht says, "Not a man and not a penny for this system, and I add, no new taxes, neither good ones nor bad ones." Um, so there's plenty of other examples of this sort of thinking, but this is the crucial point about reforms from Marx and Engels. It's not this kind of, yes, there are all sorts of concerns you might have about how various reform measures might influence the way the workers understand their relationship to the state. You certainly wouldn't want the working class seeing the state as being, um, a representative of their interests. You would want them to see themselves as represented by opposition to the existing state. And that kind of fundamental opposition that is, on almost all questions, just pure opposition, to the existing state and to all the measures undertaken by the state and to all the proposed legislation that goes before the lawmaking body. This kind of fundamental opposition, and above all, opposition to any effort of the state to collect tax revenue or to fund itself by passing a budget or by borrowing money or anything like this, any efforts of the state to appropriate revenue. This sort of opposition is the crucial political function of the proletarian party, the crucial political function, at least as regards the kind of official political sphere. Of course, there's also the whole sphere of civil society organization, especially the trade unions. But leaving that aside for the moment, this is what's being left out. So when when the author of the article we were discussing raises the welfare state as an example of a victory won by a revolution, it's it's so painfully confused and so painfully at odds with Marx and Engels' own conception that it's really, any clarifications that come in the course of the article on other points, I think, are utterly squandered by the confusion sown on this point. Okay, so I'll leave it there, and now we're kind of at time, but I don't know if you or anyone else had anything else to bring up before we conclude, Clint.
Oh, I'll just say Neville Chamberlain said in 1930, he was asked what his legacy was, and he's the guy who basically introduces the welfare state in England. And he said, "Well, I destroyed class struggle, and I don't know if I'll be like if history will be damning me for that." But I think this is a great preview to next week and the weeks after. So thanks, Reed.
Yeah, thank you, Clint. And we may be beginning late next week as well, so I will try to keep you updated on that if you follow any of the social media for this channel. And I will be, if you're watching this live now, I will be posting the videos both of last week and this week, as well as the audio for the podcast stream as soon as I can. Apologize for the delay on that. But thank you for watching. And if you have anything you'd like to see discussed, please bring it to me. You can, I think, probably Twitter is probably the easiest way to contact me at the moment. So yeah, thanks for watching, and see you next week.